It's estimated that millions of Bitcoin are lost, gone forever.
No matter how much you own, I think we all need to start thinking about being caretakers of this generational wealth and making certain that your Bitcoin doesn't fall into this 15 to 25% that has been lost.
Is self-custody for everybody? So it's estimated that millions of Bitcoin are lost, gone forever. Bitcoin in self-custody gives us true ownership and self-sovereignty. If you mismanage your seed phrase or don't secure your Bitcoin for your family, wealth disappears. Today, we're going to discuss how to keep your Bitcoin secure and keep it safe for your family. I'm going to start with Jimmy. Jimmy has written 5 books. He's been an educator for many years. Is self-custody for everybody?
I don't think so. And that's going to sound a little bit controversial because this is something that we say all the time in the community, that we should, everyone should custody their own coins. I agree. If you can, if you're able to, if you're, if you've educated yourself and you're motivated to do it, I think that's a great thing to be doing. But should a 7-year-old girl do it, or a 95-year-old dementia patient do it? No, I don't think so. And this is where we have to come up with better solutions for people like that, because you're not always going to have the same cognitive abilities that you do now. And unfortunately, we tend to think, okay, we're always going to be the same, and like I'm going to remember how to do all of this stuff. But that's not always going to be the case. You might suffer a stroke. You might get cancer. You might have things happen to you. So sort of solving for those possible scenarios, I think, is a big part of the challenge of self-custody. And that's something that we unfortunately don't talk too much about. It's almost always, write down 12 words, you idiot. And that's sort of like where the whole conversation ends. But we change, and that's kind of that's a reality that we have to come to terms with and figure out what to do about.
What do you say, Craig?
There are a lot of people, I agree with what Jimmy said. There are a lot of people that do have Bitcoin inheritance plans set up. But I'd say there's maybe more that are a little bit overwhelmed with documenting all the procedures necessary to pass their Bitcoin down to their heirs. And then you need to think about the legal title as well, which is a whole set of legal documents, power of attorney, will or trust, depending if you're common law or civil law. So it can be overwhelming. And there's lots of people working in this space to make it simpler, but as Jimmy says, there's a lot of use cases that still need improvement.
Alex, what have you seen with people in person and the fears that they have around this?
Well, in the years of being involved in my local community as a volunteer, I've seen many people come in with the impression that self-custody is extremely difficult. Honestly, I don't think it is as difficult as it seems, but sovereignty requires responsibility. Maybe that's the biggest fear. It also requires, of course, some time and effort. But as the song goes, nothing worth having comes without some kind of fight, right? So I can see 2 common profiles. The people that is used to buy Bitcoin on an exchange or neobank, whatever. They're used to the convenience of those services. And maybe they're not aware of the risks involved, or maybe they are, but they don't really know where to start with self-custody. And then on the other hand, there's the person who already wants to take the step into self-custody. They've read some books. They know the tools, but they get stuck. And this is a different fear. because they are afraid of losing funds if they make a mistake. So I think it is important to see self-custody as a journey that you build confidence and improve over time with practice.
Mate, what are some of the biggest mistakes you've seen people make with self-custody?
The biggest mistake is procrastination, in my opinion. And I heard about so many people having their Trezor sitting on bookshelf for a year, waiting for another exchange hack or huge price spike. But I think that you don't want to do your security setup under influence of panic. And I believe that you can do some mistakes, but you should do them as early as possible, sooner than later, and you will learn along the way. And just start using that as soon as possible, and you will learn it.
Jimmy, what are some of your concerns about the complexity of taking self-custody?
Yeah, so there's a lot of different aspects to that, right? Because I think the point that was made about there being a responsibility required in self-custody is absolutely right. Like that's something that people are not comfortable with, not because the responsibility is so difficult. It's just that they're not used to being responsible for stuff. And this is part of sort of like a fiat contagion. It used to be for a long time, for example, that stocks and bonds and stuff were bearer instruments. You literally got like a piece of paper that said, here's a share of IBM, and that represented actually a share of IBM. And if you lost that piece of paper, then you no longer own like a share of IBM. But all of those things became sort of like registered instruments because a lot of people made mistakes in that regard. And so people just sort of got robbed of this responsibility, right? Like, and it's like a character building thing to learn how to be responsible for stuff like that. So that's something that I think is a mental hurdle to overcome as a result of the fiat system. That just people aren't used to being responsible for things. But I want to go back to this whole idea of self-custody, and I think this is something that as a community we've concentrated a little too much on. Is this idea that this Bitcoin belongs to you and you only. And therefore, like whatever happens afterwards, like it doesn't matter or whatever. And somebody mentioned something about inheritance and things like that. But if it really is this pristine asset that's going to last a very long time, then we have to kind of start thinking differently about it, because you're not just the owner of it. You're kind of a caretaker, and there are going to be other people that are going to use it and have access to it and are going to be responsible for it. And if you're thinking in those terms, it's a very different sort of mentality than maybe, hey, I'm responsible for this Bitcoin, or I have this Bitcoin and I can spend it however I want. It's about, making sure that access to it isn't lost if you die and things like that. So, that's a part of it. The other part is, I read a statistic recently about the average age at which people die now is so high that oftentimes when you do pass off your stuff, it's like when you're in your 80s or 90s, right? And by then, your children are in their 60s. And they're far past the point where they can actually use the money that you could have given them. So it ends up going to their estate, and their children don't get it until, they die, and that might be when they're 80 or 90 as well. So it ends up being like, wealth concentrates really with the old in that case. And if we're thinking sort of in a self-sovereignty kind of way, like where you're very focused on the individual, then it gets to be like that where only the old people have the money. But if you're thinking more generationally, like at a family level, then things are a little different, right? Like instead of giving them the inheritance when you die at 95, maybe you give it to them when they're 20, right? And you're 45 or something like that, or 55 or 65, and help them out a little earlier when the money can do a lot more good for them. Now, that means that they have to be responsible as well. And it's this whole idea that, it's not just yours, right? In a sense, like if you're part of a legacy, then you have to think in broader terms, which I think as a community, we're not quite there yet. We're still getting people used to 12 words and blah, blah, blah. If you study like very successful families and things like that, they have like family councils and like, very elaborate structures to make sure that the property that they have are propagated properly to their descendants and so on. And that's the sort of thing that I think we need to think and talk more about rather than just this very narrow band of self-sovereignty.
Craig, would you like to comment on that? That's your area.
Yeah, I don't think there's a magic number for people to say, when do I need to get my inheritance plan implemented? The traditional way to think about it is, how much of an asset do you own, the percent of your net worth, your age, and so forth. But as Jimmy alludes to, Bitcoin is generational wealth. So no matter how much you own, I think we all need to start thinking about being caretakers of this generational wealth and making certain that your Bitcoin doesn't fall into this 15 to 25% that has been lost. So that involves documenting how to self-custody it to your heirs, pass it down, and, as I said, the legal title piece as well.
And Alex, what complexity concerns have you had when dealing in person in self-custody?
Well, there are all kind of people, So it depends if you're technical or no. You need to take the right approach to attend different people. And as I said before, just be empathetic with the people you're trying to introduce into Bitcoin. And if they're not technical, do not start with a very advanced technical thing, because they will be lost from the very beginning. They will lost interest and they will be more confused than they were. So.
And that's something that I've seen a lot. If you've ever had like a relative or somebody that doesn't know about Bitcoin and you try to teach them something like how to store coins on a cold card or something like that, their eyes gloss over, right? Like, and I've had this situation happen so many times where you have one spouse that's really into Bitcoin and another spouse that's not. And then, like they try to teach them, okay, all right, if I die, you go get these words from this vault and these other words from this vault. You use these 3 devices and you load this one to this one, and their eyes are completely glossed over. They have no idea what's going on, and they're completely kind of at a loss. And if something does happen to that spouse, you can sort of imagine, okay, they're like, at best, they're going to go hire maybe some other expert and try to figure out what happened instead of putting it all back together. And that tends to happen all over the place. And it's not like an uncommon thing. And I've heard of a lot of inheritance plans and things like that as being treasure hunts, right? Have you ever heard this? Where you have to go try to figure out where all the assets are. And Bitcoin takes it to like a whole other level where it's like, okay, it's a treasure hunt with these 7 steps, and if you screw up any of them, then you like kind of end up losing it. That's not a situation you want your family to be in. So it's my opinion that you need to be bringing in your heirs into your wealth like way earlier before you die, right? And if they're not interested, then you need to either make it clear that they need to be interested if they want to inherit this wealth, or figure some other way out, right? Because this is a big problem, like trying to get, basically your heirs to be interested in the very asset that's made you wealthy.
Yeah, Jimmy mentioned that people are not used to self-custody and self-sovereignty. And I think that every person should ask themselves two questions. The first is whether I'm able to use my setup regularly and at least once a month. And I believe that if you use it often, then you get used to it. And you see if it's overcomplicated because it's just too hard for you to use it. And the second important question is, if I'm not here, will my relatives be able to figure out how to use it or how to recover it?
And that's something that very few people do. It's like practice their setup, right? You have this elaborate 7 of 13 multisig, and they never practice it, so it ends up like getting lost. It's horrible.
We've talked a little bit about inheritance, but Craig, we've spoken about that most Bitcoiners tend to keep their Bitcoin safe from hackers, but they don't always leave it clear for their family. What do you say to that?
Yeah, as we've been alluding to, you need a solid plan, both on the custody side and on the legal title side. And as we said here, you need to practice that. So we sort of preach every 6 months, every 12 months, you have a family routine where you go through the recovery process. And you, as Jimmy said, you ideally have a structure. If you're, some people are thinking that they don't want their family ever to sell their Bitcoin. They want to keep it as generational wealth, maybe borrow against it. And so you need to document this. There's different ways to do it. There's, in America, there's the Rockefeller way. But documenting it and having an incremental 12-month plan, I'd say, that's reviewed is a good start.
Alex, you hosted an inheritance workshop, and one of your most popular was with a 76-year-old man. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, it's true. It was our most attended meetup, and I think it proved that a lot of people wants to secure that Bitcoin not only for themselves, but also for the future of the people they love. And yeah, it was led by London B. Johnson. This is his alias. Kudos to him. He's one of the most loved members of our community. And as someone in his 70s, I think he's a great example that anyone with curiosity and interest can learn about self-custody. So no excuses, guys. There's no excuse in here. And yeah, he had recently prepared his own inheritance plan. He was willing to share the process he had followed with us. And that made the conversation very, very moving and honest. He highlighted the idea that priority should be your heirs. That's the most important thing, meaning that they should be able to recover your funds once you're gone without feeling lost or scared or depending on someone they don't trust. And he also tried to warn us because we all know this topic matters, but we keep postponing it. Because there are some topics hard to deal with as humans, like death, like responsibility. So his advice was, start thinking in your inheritance plan before it feels urgent. right?
Yeah, it can be overwhelming because many family members don't really have the same technical skills, like Jimmy said.
Well, not even just technical skills. They have like no interest, right?
Yeah.
And that's the real problem is, with other forms of inheritance, if it's like land or something like that, you get sort of the benefits of it without having to know the minutiae of like title insurance or, tax law or, how deeds work. And, you just hire a real estate agent, they can sell it for you and you're done. But with Bitcoin, it's like you have this wealth, but it's locked up to a certain amount of responsibility and skill. And if you don't have that, then it's kind of a useless thing. So it ends up being very difficult because people generally like access to wealth. And that's why it's kind of nice to get an inheritance, right? But they don't like the responsibility aspect, especially if they're not interested. Like, I'm sure many of you have relatives that are not interested in Bitcoin. And you've tried to get them interested. You told them about seed phrases and wallets and hardware and all that stuff. And the eyes glaze over, right? They're just like, what? I don't care. Like, what does this have to do with me? And really, they think of Bitcoin as like every other asset. Okay, if you die, I just get it, right? Like, and I don't have to do anything. That's kind of the problem. People don't understand that there's some responsibility and skill involved. It's almost like you're inheriting a car or something, but you have to drive it over somewhere before you can sell it. And there's some amount of skill involved in being able to unlock it, and that ends up making it kind of a difficult situation. Which is why I think we need better tools. We need better solutions for a lot of this stuff, because I've been doing this for 13 years now, right? Where I've tried to convince people. You're not going to convince them, even if there's a lot of money at the end of it, right? They just want access to the wealth, not necessarily the skills that are required to wield it.
Maybe you don't need to start with explaining those technical stuff and seed phrases and so on, but I think that Bitcoin is useful only when you use it, right? And you can start using Bitcoin without those things. Just install the app on the phone of your relatives and send them something, and they will learn along the way or not, maybe. But yeah, I think that's the way to use it.
I don't know about that, because I've had relatives where I've taught them how to install an app or whatever, and yeah, for those 5 minutes they pay attention. But you ask them a month later, hey, remember the 20 bucks in Bitcoin I gave you? Oh yeah, I deleted that app because I wasn't using it. Oh yeah, the $20 are gone. That stuff happens all the time, and and you might have given it to them 10 years ago, and the $20 is worth $2,000, and they don't know, right? And that it's because they're not cognitively engaged. And I'm not sure you can force cognitive engagement on other people that aren't interested. So that's kind of the problem that I think we're having to wrestle with, I think, as Bitcoiners that have relatives and friends and people that we care about that aren't necessarily interested in all this stuff.
Yeah, but that was my point. If you give them $20 on that wallet and they will lose it, you just lost $20. That's not that much. But maybe after a couple of years, they found out, oh, if I haven't deleted this app, maybe I can learn more about it.
Maybe you have different kinds of relatives and friends, but they just sort of regret that they didn't learn about it before, but then they're not necessarily motivated to still learn about it.
The thing is, if they are not even willing to learn, probably they're not interested in keeping it when they inherit it. So maybe just teach them how to sell it, and then that's...
Yeah, that's probably what a vast majority of those types of relatives and friends and heirs are going to do, is they're probably going to get rid of it.
They don't see the value in it.
Yeah.
You need to put in the proof of work and actually earn the Bitcoin yourself. So if you get your kids working on that, that might help this problem, but it is a problem.
Yeah.
But do you think there are different solutions for different families? We know that there's companies that provide multisig and different approaches.
Yeah, I think the only real teacher is time and success, right? And that's, I think, what's convinced a lot of my family, for example. Like I told my parents back in 2013, hey, you guys should go buy some of this stuff. It's $80. I know that sounds expensive, but you should probably get a little bit of this stuff. And I sent them all the material I could, and it was in Korean so they would feel more comfortable. They watched the video and they were like, I don't get it. And they didn't buy any, right? And it was only after like 5 or 6 years of that stuff, me getting a job in the industry, them reading about it on their own, like sort of popping up, not because they sought it, but it like showed up in the newspapers that they read and stuff like that. And then they were like, oh, yeah, I guess this is something. Maybe I should go get some. And then they were motivated to do it. Like, it's only then that and they still don't know anything about seed phrases or hardware wallets or any of that. They just know they have some, and I end up being their bank, right? Like I'm holding their Bitcoin for them. And honestly, I don't know if that's that terrible, right? Because I'm not sure I would trust them with a seed phrase and a hardware wallet and all that stuff. And maybe that's the right way for it to go, where you have somebody that's more technical, that's kind of being their bank for them, and they have access to the wealth, they have exposure, but not necessarily all of the responsibility that they're not ready for.
I hold my family's Bitcoin as well. So, but at the same time, then if something happens to me, they don't know how to get it.
Yeah, this is where I had this app that I've been working on for a couple of years, which I really should finish, which has it's like a family bank app, right? Because I'm sure it's true of for many of you where you're holding coins for your relatives or friends or children or whatever, and you have like different accounts, and it's not segregated very well and all that. But one of the things, I don't know if Will Cole is here, but I did a whole podcast where we were planning out this app. But one of the things that surfaced is the inheritance aspect. What happens when the bank goes away? How do you make sure everyone gets it? So we came up with this thing, dead man switch transaction. Just a single transaction that sends everybody their money, usually on an exchange or something, so they don't have to think about self-custody. But you die, there's a dead man switch transaction that's already with your estate attorney. All they have to do is press broadcast and everyone gets it. So I would like solutions like that to come around, where you don't have to worry so much about, okay, you have to go to this bank vault to get one seed phrase, and then you have to go to this other bank vault to get this other seed phrase, and then you have to load it onto these hardware wallets, and then you have to get the descriptor from this other file that I sent you, and then load it onto this wallet called Sparrow, and then sign it, and then load the QR code over, and then, it's like way too complicated, right? Like that's not something people are willing to do. So more simple solutions would be very much welcome.
We're working on this problem along with a number of other people. Citadel Vault was launched here. It's the first inheritance computer, an air-gapped computer dedicated to this solution. So I didn't mean to shill it today, but come by booth 22 and check it out if you're interested.
Well, they say that Bitcoin is for people who are ready, and that means, Alex, when they come to see you in person, they're ready. What can you teach people in person that books and videos can't?
Okay, don't get me wrong, because I've learned a lot from podcasts, books, online resources. So nothing against that, quite the contrary, okay? But let's say you're following an online guide and something does not match what you see on your screen, and then you can feel alone because there's no one else in the room to ask, right? And you're involved in a local community, which basically is a web of trust. If you attend your local meetup, you can ask questions in real time. You can practice. You can see how others do it. And somehow sharing this process with others feels less intimidating. And then something beautiful happens because the person who learns gains confidence and often ends up helping the next person. So knowledge is passed on, and it feels like being part of a culture where people help each other to become more independent. If I may, I would like to ask you how many of you are part of a community, like Bitcoin community? Do you attend Bitcoin meetups? A few?
Conferences maybe sometime.
Yeah, well, thank you. Thank you. And I'd like to give a shout out to all the Bitcoin communities out there around the world because they are promoting the core values, self-custody first and foremost, but also no KYC, privacy, how to run your own node, verify everything for yourself. That's what it's all about for me. And I encourage you to search for your nearest local community and just go there, join, because it's totally worth it.
All right, so if I may, I think free is the wrong model. And I say that because oftentimes if you teach something like that for free, oftentimes people don't value it. And I think you should have to pay for it. And this is something that I learned, like teaching people stuff, is that they value it way more when they're paying you to do it. And they're way more motivated to learn things very specifically because they're paying you to do it. Whereas if you sort of, and I've run into this when I've, tried to teach relatives, hey, here's a wallet, here's how you do things or whatever. They don't pay attention because they're not paying for it. There's no skin in the game, right? But if they have to pay for it, it starts becoming kind of like a thing that they care about. I liken hardware wallets and Bitcoin custody to something like a gun, right? It is technically possible for you to learn how to shoot a gun on your own just by watching videos. I would not recommend it though. And you can learn from a friend that already knows how to shoot a gun, how to do things, but you're probably not going to learn that well. But if you pay somebody to teach you how to use a gun, that's probably going to be the best way for you to make sure that you really get it. And I think in the Bitcoin community, we need to be going down the same route, is actually paying people so that you have skin in the game, so that you're motivated to learn, so that they have some obligation to you to make sure that they're teaching you properly, and they don't want to get sued because they taught you the wrong thing and you lost a whole bunch of Bitcoin, right? So there are lots of incentives that are good when there's a market transaction involved, which I think can be very beneficial in this.
I tend to agree, and there's a lot of good mentorships out there. Maybe your first interactions or first experiences are good enough to go to your local meetup or your friend, and then pay for it, skin in the game. Yeah.
Mate, what is one thing that you feel that self-custody users or Trezor users, what would you like them to know before setting up their device?
I think that I would like everyone knows that the device itself is replaceable, but the seed is not. And yeah, Still, there are people that has this wrong mental model of the seed being something like a password that they can recover if they send it to Trezor support and so on. And we know about those cases that people are really sending their whole seed to tech support because they see it as some kind of identifier of their wallet. And yeah, I believe that most people understand that, but still not everyone.
Well, most of us Bitcoiners love self-sovereignty. And Jimmy, you have been involved with running nodes and setting up a company. Can you be truly self-sovereign if you don't run a node?
I mean, you start having to trust people, and that's where you kind of get in trouble. Now, like running a node, like there are ways to sort of like check multiple different websites against each other, so you can get a fair idea of whether or not someone's trying to deceive you or not. So I don't think it's quite as essential on that score, but I think it's a good practice because you're not leaking privacy. And that's the part that I think a lot of people tend to think, okay, well, I'm helping the network in some way. In some small way you are, but mostly it's for your own privacy, not necessarily because, you know, a bunch of people are trying to deceive you or whatever. It's so that you're not leaking information to block explorers and things like that that would otherwise have your information about the transactions you're doing, possibly the amount of Bitcoin you have and things like that. So you want to be running your own node for your own protection, particularly in the privacy arena. I do want to, I was thinking about what you were saying about hardware wallets, and this is one of my pet peeves, so allow me to complain a little here while I have you, which is that the firmware keeps updating, right? And this is one of my pet peeves, is that every time there's like a new address type or whatever, there's a new firmware update and you have to update it. Or, you know, I mean, obviously, if it's the Bitcoin only one, it updates a little less frequently. But if it's like the altcoin model, then every new altcoin or any new changes in any of the altcoins requires like a new firmware update. That doesn't seem very good to me, because every time you're updating the firmware is a whole huge attack surface. And I would like a device that doesn't change that much, right? And you know, you don't have to learn a new process for because the firmware changed or something like that. Yeah. So that small complaint. But I want to do it. Yeah.
The issue is that the security is not like fixed issue, or it's not something that you can solve at one point and then it's solved forever. And there are still like new issues found, and we are of course working to fix them. So I
vast majority of firmware updates are not security patches, are they?
Yeah, of course they are not. But
so we'll carry that on. But let's end it on a positive note. One thing, our time is up. But Craig, one inheritance tip that people can do this month.
Make a plan, execute it.
Thank you very much.